Hi there, good afternoon. Thanks ever so much for joining me this afternoon. I'm Toby, and it's great to see you on the webinar today. So just a kind of bit of webinar admin or housekeeping. The lines are muted just to minimize any background noise and disruption. However, you can interact with us. The best way to do that is to use the chat facility within Webinar Ninja. So let's just give that a test run. So if you should find a chat button. So if you open that, it will open up the chat window. And if you could just put in a message, just to say hello, that would be great. I'll just give you a minute to do that. So we'll use the chat feature today to if you want to add any contribution to the session, if you've got links to resources, that kind of thing, it's always really handy to drop it into the chat. However, if you want to ask me any questions for me to pick up in the webinar, it's better to use the Q&A feature for that. So you'll also notice there should be like a questions button or a Q&A button. You can just drop in questions, and those questions then go directly to me, and I'll be keeping an eye on the Q&A inbox, and then I can pick up questions throughout the presentation. So by way of introduction, if you don't know me, I'm Toby, and I'm a diversity and inclusion architect. I work with HR directors and senior business leaders to help them create inclusive workplaces where people feel like they belong and can thrive, and also create organizations that enables talent to enter the organization regardless of background. Some of my recent clients, I've been working with HarperCollins Publishing, delivering D&I training. I've been working with Sony Pictures around unconscious bias in decision making. And then I've been working with a number of businesses to help them develop their D&I strategies. So these are just some of the clients that I've been working with over the last 12 months. I've been working with clients both in the UK and outside of the UK, and in all sorts of sectors, both the public and the private sector, and in all sorts of industries, ranging from education to energy to consultancy and travel. So I'm the author of the book Inclusive Growth. Inclusive Growth is a really practical, hands-on book for anybody who's responsible for implementing diversity and inclusion in their organization. It gives you a really practical framework for implementing sustainable change within your business. So if you want to get your hands on a copy of the book, then you can get it on Amazon. And it's both available in the paperback and Kindle version as well. So I just kind of wanted to let you know a bit about my background before I get into the content of today's session, just to kind of set the scene as to how I got into diversity and inclusion and my part within it. So when I left university, the first part of my career was working in technology. I was an IT consultant for Accenture. I worked in healthcare technology, and then I worked at the BBC as a technical project manager. So I worked on the redevelopment of the BBC News website. I worked on accessibility projects, digital accessibility projects, and I worked on the creation of the BBC Sounds app. And it was when I was working in the technology division that I first got involved in diversity and inclusion. Unofficially, I was doing D&I suppose, because I've got a disability. I'm a wheelchair user. I was born with a rare genetic disability. So I was involved and I chaired the BBC's Disabled Staff Forum. But when I was working in technology, I was working with our chief operating officer, and he, and along with the directors of the division, were concerned that the technology department at the BBC was a very male-dominated division. The BBC is about 50-50 male-female, but within technology or design and engineering, we were at about 14% female at the time. I mean, this was a challenge for the technology and engineering sector. We were in the same boat as Amazon and Facebook and Google. But I worked with the management team of that division to create our gender balance action plan. Then I realized that I really loved working in the field of D&I, and I did a sideways move. I moved into our HR department and I took on a bigger portfolio. So I continued to look after technology, but then I also looked after our radio division and the BBC, all of the corporate services like finance, HR, and legal. So about a third of the BBC in terms of headcount. I decided at that point that I wanted to go back to the corporate sector. You see, the business case for diversity at the BBC is quite straightforward. The BBC is a public service broadcaster. Everyone pays their license fee, and everybody deserves or needs to see themselves reflected in the content that the BBC produces. But I was particularly interested in why a big corporation or corporate body like Deloitte, one of the big four accountancy firms, was so interested in diversity. And also Deloitte had a much more of a focus on culture change than I was getting involved with at the BBC. And so I wanted to get experience on culture change as well. I then decided to set up my own consultancy practice, which I've just named Milden. So I've made a number of assumptions when I put this presentation together for you this afternoon. So I've made the assumption that you already understand the business case for diversity and inclusion, and I don't need to explain to you why diversity and inclusion is important for businesses. If you do want to find out more about the business case, then I do recommend reading McKinsey's latest report, which is titled "Diversity Wins: How Inclusion Matters." They've now produced 3 reports, and Diversity Wins is their latest report, which came out in February this year, or earlier this year for sure. I've made the assumption that you are already implementing diversity and inclusion in your organizations, and one of the main reasons why you're joining the session this afternoon is that you're looking for ideas of best practice, or you're just starting out on implementing diversity and inclusion and you're looking for some clarity or ideas on how to proceed. I've already made the assumption that you are a HR professional, that you are a diversity and inclusion practitioner, or you are sponsoring diversity and inclusion in your organization as a senior leader. I've looked through your job titles when you registered, and that's pretty much the makeup of today's audience as well. I've also made the assumption that you don't want to be sold to. I'm just conscious that I think a lot of people are getting a bit webinar fatigued during lockdown, and everyone's kind of spending the whole day sat on Zoom. And I am conscious that a lot of webinars are kind of, I think they're kind of mispositioned as basically sales pitches. They're kind of, they're promoted as training, but actually they're kind of a sales pitch in disguise. I just want to reassure you that this is not a sales pitch, that I'm not going to sell to you. However, I will spend about 5 minutes just sort of in the middle of the presentation, just explaining any next steps that you might want to take with me if anything I say today does resonate with you. But other than that, I will not be doing any selling. So today's agenda, we're just going to look at why diversity and inclusion is more important than ever during the pandemic. We'll be talking about why we need to start with employee feedback to shape your strategy, how you can get executive sponsorship or maintain executive sponsorship, particularly when senior leaders are operating under immense pressure at the moment, keeping their businesses going during the pandemic. I will give you a framework for sustainable change. I'll give you a template that you can use as a D&I strategy. And then I'll just talk about how we can be agile so that you can get results. And then I'll just, as I said at the end, I'll just spend a couple of minutes explaining next steps if you're interested in seeing that. So let's just spend a bit of time talking about why diversity and inclusion is more important than ever. I've just seen a comment come in from Nikki actually saying, "Is it just me? I can't see the Q&A feature." It is turned on, I don't know if anyone else can see it. There should be a button that says Q&A. Otherwise, Nikki, just feel free to pop questions in the chat box, because I'm keeping an eye on both, by the way. So feel free to do that. So why is D&I more important than ever? So I often talk to my clients about the diversity inclusion is really about helping organizations increase their resiliency. And I think that this is really, really important now more than ever, because businesses are going through really difficult times. We're going through the pandemic. They're going through a difficult time delivering products and services. Businesses are having to rapidly go through huge transformations. We've all seen it in the press how businesses have had, overnight have had to go from being a bricks and mortar business to an online or digital business, and that's putting organizations under immense pressure. But diversity really helps organizations increase their resiliency. We know from lots of academic research now that diversity enables better and faster decision making. We can have greater customer empathy, and we can develop products and services that meet those customer needs. We get increased people engagement, and we get higher innovation, more creativity, better decision making as a result of having a diverse workforce and an inclusive culture, which enables everybody to perform at their best. And I think resiliency is really, really important right now in terms of how businesses are dealing with and reacting to the pandemic, but in the resiliency that they're going to need in order to move forwards. So this is a graph of the FTSE 100 going back to sort of early 2000s up until sort of late last year, really. And I kind of wanted to show this to you because you can see that there were two recessions. So the early 2000s and then sort of around 2007, 2008. This is where the economy dipped, as indicated by the red dashed boxes on the screen. What it means is that when businesses go through a period where the economy is really going down, that we kind of have to change or have a different approach to diversity and inclusion. And that's about having an inclusive response to the downturn in the economy, because organizations are having to make difficult decisions about making people redundant or putting people on furlough, for example, or scaling back on certain activities. And what that means is that we often see things like unconscious bias play into the decision making that execs are making. And so what that means is that we need to have like an inclusivity lens over some of the decisions that we're making. So, for example, some organizations have very rapidly overnight had to make sure that their entire workforce is able to work from home and remotely. And some organizations have kind of taken a blanket approach to that. But what they haven't really thought about is the individual needs of certain members of staff. So it might be that you've got somebody in the organization who has a disability or a long-term health condition, and they've got reasonable adjustments in place at the office. Perhaps those reasonable adjustments haven't been transferred to their new work environment at home, for instance. So it's about making sure that any decisions that we make in such a kind of a period, you're having that kind of inclusivity lens over the top of it. But it's also about growth, because we will bounce back from, in terms of recession speaking, we will bounce back. But this is a perfect opportunity to be growing our businesses in an inclusive way. It's a perfect opportunity to be developing products and services that are more inclusive. It's a great opportunity to be more inclusive of our diverse customer base, for instance, and to be able to bounce back or regrow in an inclusive way. So you'll see again on this chart that after the 2 years of the first recession in the early 2000s, that there was a period of a few years where the economy was growing. Then we hit another crisis where we had a big dip, and then the economy grew again over another 10 years or so. So, when the economy is growing back up, this is where we need to switch our focus to kind of inclusive regrowth or inclusive growth. And that was really the whole point of me writing the book. I really wanted to reposition the way that organizations were talking about diversity and inclusion, moving away from being a box ticking exercise or people feeling like it's the right thing to do. It's absolutely the right thing to do. But I wanted to get organizations to really think about how diversity and inclusion is an enabler of growth for the organization, and that it's strategically aligned to the business. So that's kind of a way of that's a different way of thinking about how diversity and inclusion can be there to empower your business. So having that inclusive response approach when we go through difficult times, but then having that inclusive regrowth mindset when things start to bounce back. And I suppose this is a conversation that you can have with senior leaders in your business. So, how do we respond to the current crisis in an inclusive way? What does that look like for us? How do we do that in an inclusive way? And then when we start to see things bouncing back, how do we do that in an inclusive way? How do we really leverage diversity and inclusion so that we can bounce back stronger than before? So whenever you're creating your diversity and inclusion strategy or plans for how you want to move forwards, I think it's really important to kind of start from the inside out, and that's to really listen to the employees that you've already got and get their feedback. So there's the way that I look at this is really you want feedback in order to help you eliminate barriers along particular employee journeys or along the employee life cycle. So if you think about your organization, I've oversimplified this, but effectively, somebody is attracted to come and work for you, or you go out searching for talent, and you let them know that you're there and you're looking for new talent to come into the business. The journey into your organization has the potential of people coming across lots of speed humps and roadblocks. So the things that might slow them down in terms of coming to work for you, or things that might prevent them from working for you altogether. So there's all sorts of speed humps and roadblocks in recruitment. So is everybody able to reach the job offer stage within your organization? So for example, if you take job applications online through your careers portal or website or applicant tracking system, if your careers website doesn't work well with screen readers, which is assistive technology that blind people use to be able to navigate around the computer and around the internet, if your careers website doesn't work with that technology, then somebody who's blind is not able to submit a job application with you, for instance. And there could also be other kind of speed humps and roadblocks. For example, there could be all sorts of bias that's embedded within your recruitment process that detracts people from entering your organization. So once somebody is in your organization, again, there could be numbers of speed humps and roadblocks that prevents them from really developing themselves and reaching their full potential. And again, it's about identifying those speed humps and roadblocks. So as an organization, how good are you, for example, in supporting working parents? Are you do you create the right environment where working parents are able to thrive? Or do you have a particular culture that makes it difficult for working parents to thrive within the organization? And then finally, we've got retention. So are you creating the right kind of atmosphere or culture where people feel like they belong to the organization, where they feel like they fit in, and where they see themselves working for you in the kind of the medium to long term, and they're not thinking about leaving, and you have that culture where people want to stick around and again do their best work. So I always look at things through the journeys that people go on. And our journeys can take lots of twists and turns. So there's a pretty kind of standard journey in terms of entering the organization, progressing within your business, and then eventually leaving your business. But all sorts of things can happen along the way. So somebody might acquire a disability, for example. Most people that are disabled acquire the disability later on in life. I'm kind of in the minority where I was born with my disability, but somebody might acquire a disability, but again, are you set up in such a way that that individual employee has the adjustments that they need to be able to perform at their best in the role? So really, when it comes to understanding employee experience, we need to have a balance of both sort of quantitative and qualitative feedback. So on the quantitative side, this is just a short list of what is possible. But on the quantitative side, we can look at attrition data, for example. But looking at attrition data through different lenses. So if you were to look at your attrition data, for example, by gender, you might notice that women are more likely to leave your organization. So you might have more employee churn amongst women in the business, for example, or you might have more employee churn from people who are from a Black or Asian minority ethnic background, for instance. And you might be able to look at that data across different levels of your organization. So you might see that attrition is fairly low at your entry level, but perhaps at the senior levels, it's higher. When you have that kind of insight and that kind of data, when you're able to look at employee data through different diversity lenses, you're then able to take targeted action where it's most needed. And that's really important, because one of the biggest complaints that I hear from diversity and inclusion managers is that organizations are basically wasting a lot of time and a lot of money trying to fix the wrong problems for the organization. So they're not really inspecting the data deep enough to really find out where the problem lies. So if you notice that attrition is happening amongst a particular group of people at a particular level of the organization, that means that you can take targeted action at that particular cohort rather than taking a blanket approach. So it's a lot more specific, and you get a lot more return on your investment and effort on any kind of D&I initiatives that you implement. You can also get quantitative data from engagement surveys by asking quantitative questions. And if you don't already, you might also do a diversity and inclusion census in order to get a snapshot of the diversity of your workforce. Then there's the qualitative feedback that you get. So, for example, you might run focus groups or listening exercises. If you do 360-degree feedback for your managers, there might be sort of qualitative text from employees about how inclusive their line manager is being. And then you also might want to run some surveys in addition to any engagement surveys or D&I censuses that you run, in terms of getting that kind of qualitative feedback from people about what the culture is like in your organization, what they think you're doing well around diversity and inclusion, what room for improvement there is, and the such like. So you need a balance of both quantitative and qualitative in order to get a nice, well-rounded picture. So before I go on and talk about the sort of how you get exec engagement, if I've said anything so far that does resonate with you, then you can have a strategy session with me. So in the strategy session, I will ask lots of questions so that I can just get to understand what's going on in your organization a bit more, really kind of dig deep so that I can find out what's going on. Then at the end of the strategy session, I can offer you up one strategy, and then we can have a conversation to see if we think it's a good match, if there's any way that I can help you along your D&I journey. So I'm just putting that out there. If you are interested in having that strategy session with me, just pop a comment in the comment box saying I'm interested. And then after the session today, I'll just drop you an email just to kind of get that booked into our calendars. So, how do we then get executive sponsorship during the pandemic? As I said earlier, it's really quite, a lot of senior business leaders and executives are operating under a lot of pressure at the moment to keep their businesses going. One of the things that I have heard from people is that, diversity and inclusion seems to be falling down the priority list in some organizations. And the big question is, how do we get execs continuing to sponsor diversity and inclusion if we know that diversity and inclusion is still important for business survival, for business resiliency, and to enable those organizations to bounce back? How do we make sure that it's top of the agenda for execs during the current situation? So I often encourage my clients to go back to the basics. Sometimes it feels like it's a bit rudimentary to have this conversation with clients. But what I do like to talk to my clients about is, revisiting the vision, mission, and values of the organization, and how diversity and inclusion can empower and support your vision, mission, and values. Because this is a good way of really getting execs to see how diversity and inclusion is important to the whole reason why the business or organization was established in the first place. And really, I suppose, strategically aligning diversity and inclusion to the organization rather than it being kind of this activity that's done on the side of somebody's desk or the side of the business, or it's seen as a CSR activity or a way of raising your employer brand or profiling. So I'll give you an example. So let's look at the BBC's vision, mission, and values. So the vision of the BBC is to be the most creative organization in the world. Now, we know that with diversity and inclusion, diversity and inclusion enables organizations to innovate more, to be more creative, better at decision making. So we could argue that greater diversity and inclusion at the BBC will enable the BBC to become the most creative organization in the world. Now, the mission of the BBC is to inform, educate, and entertain. This is really important for us during the pandemic, that we're informed about what's going on and what we should be doing or not doing around things like social distancing and things like that. And also, it's important that we're entertained when we're stuck at home. So arguably, greater diversity enables the BBC to do that in a really good way. It enables to connect with a diverse audience base in order to inform, educate, and entertain that diverse customer base. Now, the BBC has got several values, and I've just kind of picked out one. This was my favorite one when I worked at the BBC, and it's "We are one BBC, great things happen when we work together." Now, some organizations might have explicitly stated values around diversity and inclusion. They might say something like, "We really value diversity, we believe in inclusion," and such like. Now, it's worth stress testing that, because if that's a stated value of the organization, it's worth just double checking to see if the behaviors of people are congruent with that stated value. Because I've worked with a client, I won't name them, but I did some training with a client, and behind their reception desk was a big poster that listed their values. And the second value on this poster was like a 6-foot high poster. You couldn't miss it when you went into the reception desk. It was like, "We value diversity." And I thought, that's a great start. I've entered the building. It's a great start that they're so bold about stating that their value is diversity. One of their values is about respecting diversity. Then I went into the training session, and pretty much everybody in the organization was complaining that the behaviors of the senior leadership team was not inclusive, and that they felt that they didn't value diversity whatsoever. So there was this disconnect between the stated value on the wall behind the reception desk and how employees were feeling about how the senior leaders were walking the talk in terms of valuing diversity and following inclusive leadership behaviors. So you might have an explicitly stated value like that for your organization, but the reason why I like this one from the BBC is that it's kind of implied that in order for great things to happen, we need to work together. And in order to work together, we need to behave in an inclusive fashion. And we could argue that greater inclusivity enables the BBC to be one organization and to produce great results when people work together. So when we talk about diversity and inclusion, people often kind of talk about two sides. There's a logical argument and there's the emotional argument. People might start talking about the business case of diversity and inclusion. That's kind of the logical side. They might be thinking about how diversity and inclusion increases profitability, how it improves decision making, and that kind of thing. It's kind of very logical, very business driven. Or there might be an emotional argument. It might be that there's a senior leader in the organization who just wants to be a really inclusive leader so that they feel like that the people in their team are able to perform at their best. They might be thinking about how their son or daughter fits into the future workplace. They might have a young son or daughter. Perhaps that son or daughter has got a disability, or they're LGBT, for instance, and they might be thinking about where their son or daughter fits into the future of work. And they might be thinking about what they can do to the workplace now to kind of create more inclusive workplaces for their son or daughter going forwards. There's this third part of the brain, which is kind of the big red dot, and this is kind of like the danger zone. And this is the stuff that happens on a kind of other than conscious level that really interferes with diversity and inclusion. So within the big red dot, we've got things like unconscious bias. So, how our kind of natural biases that we adopt through social conditioning or just simply the way that our brains are neurologically wired, how are those biases impacting on decision making, which ultimately impacts on the inclusivity of individuals, for instance. But it could also be that people are a bit afraid of talking about certain diversity and inclusion topics, and therefore they avoid it altogether. So I've been in situations where managers have been afraid to talk to me about disability, for instance. They're afraid of saying the wrong thing. They're not sure what terminology is the right terminology to use. They don't want to offend me by feeling like they're kind of prying on my personal life around disability. What that ultimately leads to is that we're not creating an environment of psychological safety, but it means that people are held back, and we're not having those kind of frank conversations that we need to be having about diversity and inclusion. So there are three parts of the brain that you just need to be wary of. And I think what it is about having a balance. So when you're talking to a senior person in the organization, try to appeal to the logic, but also appeal to the emotional side in order to get D&I to stick within the business. But also be conscious about what's going on in that pesky red dot in terms of what are their biases on an other than conscious level. What are some of their fears or anxieties around talking about diversity and inclusion, which might otherwise hold them back. So just an example, on the logical side, one of the arguments is that, companies with more diverse management teams are reported as having, higher innovation, for example. And this was a statistic that came out from research that Accenture did fairly recently. And then on the emotional side, that's a picture of me when I was young. I wanted to be a police officer when I grew up. And, and I guess at the time, my parents were thinking, how is Toby going to be a police officer? Because one of the requirements of a police officer is that you need to be able to be physically fit and chase after people. But, the question on my parents' lips was, how is Toby going to fit into the workplace when he's older? Luckily, I found my place in the workplace. I didn't go into the police force. I went into IT consultancy, and then got into various industries from there, really. But there's kind of two sides of the argument there. I think it's also, when you're talking to a senior exec, it's about revisiting what we talked about earlier in terms of resiliency. Now, I've given 4 suggestions on the screen, but I think it's really worth you having a conversation with senior leaders in your business about what does resiliency mean for our organization, and what are the 3 or 4 things that enable us to be resilient as an organization, and how does diversity and inclusion empower those 3 or 4 attributes that increase our resiliency. And also, it's about growth or regrowth or bouncing back. So again, having a conversation with senior execs on how diversity and inclusion is an enabler of regrowing the business or bouncing back from the business. Just as a reminder, if you've got any questions as we go, please do pop them in the chat box. I'm keeping an eye on the chat box as we go. I will pick up the questions as we're going. So yeah, feel free to just drop questions in the chat box or use the Q&A feature, and I'll keep an eye on them there as well. So I just want to share with you a framework for sustainable change. So I said earlier that a lot of organizations treat diversity and inclusion as a bit like a box ticking exercise. I think this is one of my frustrations when I worked as an in-house diversity and inclusion manager in big organizations. I just felt, and this is reflective of me talking with other D&I practitioners, sometimes D&I feels like it's a bit of a box ticking exercise. It's very tactical. It's about a program here or an event there or sponsoring something there, and it's not really getting into the DNA of the business or really the fabric of the organization to create that inclusive culture or inclusive ways of working. So it got me thinking about, what does good sustainable change look like when it comes to diversity and inclusion, which is why I wrote the book. So if you do get a copy of my book, basically, it's a framework for implementing sustainable change. The feedback that I've had from HR directors so far who've read the book is that it's a really practical guide for them. And that was my intention when I wrote the book. I wanted to be really practical. When I did my research on the literature in the D&I space, a lot of it's very theoretical. It talks about why diversity and inclusion is important for businesses, but it doesn't necessarily really go into the how do you actually implement it in the organization. And I've always been a really practical, hands-on person. And I've always wanted to see change within businesses when I was working in businesses. So that's what really inspired the content of the book, I suppose. But the book is based around this framework that I've created that I wanted to share with you. And I'm just going to talk through this, I suppose, through the framework and give you some things to think about in terms of sustainable change for your organization. And I had a meeting this week, actually, with this guy who works for a small company. They employ about 60 people. And he was saying that he really enjoyed the book as well, because he said it was really helpful for him as a small business. Again, he said a lot of these books out there are about kind of big organizations, but it was a really practical book for him on the kind of working within a small business. And yeah, thanks, Sophia. Sophia says, yes, I confirm it's a really practical guide. Thank you for that. So the framework is broken down into 3 phases of establish, evolve, and enhance, and they all build on one another. And the intention is really to move from left to right. So first of all, within establish, we've got clarity and culture. And clarity is all about understanding why diversity is important for the growth of your organization, as I've talked about earlier, that kind of regrowth. It's about getting that clarity from that employee feedback, that I talked about earlier, getting your hands on data, quantitative and qualitative feedback to be able to shape your strategy going forwards. Really getting clear on why it's important, getting all of your senior leadership team on board, getting it driven from the chief executive so that they are walking the talk, so that they are able to talk confidently about why diversity and inclusion is important for the success of the business, but also getting them to be accountable for it. So I've worked with loads of organizations where chief executives say, yeah, D&I is a really important thing for the business. Then they immediately give responsibility down to somebody like a HR director, for example. Chief executives are not really taking that accountability for diversity and inclusion. And it's really important that chief execs and their direct reports take this seriously, because they are setting the tone for the whole of the organization. So I've just comment from Nikki says, I've just ordered my copy, arrives on Saturday. Brilliant. Thank you, Nat. Thank you, Nikki. Glad it's arriving quickly. Yeah. So culture, again, is all about how you create that inclusive culture, thinking very intentionally about it, because, a management guru once said that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And it is the culture that really is really important, because that is effectively how people feel like when they show up to work in the morning, whether they feel like they belong to the organization, whether they see themselves sticking around for the organization in the medium to long term, whether they feel like they belong, or whether they feel like they have to change their personality somehow in order to fit in. So culture is hugely important, but you have to be quite intentional about how you want to set the culture. You have to think about, what does an inclusive culture look like for us? And it's very unique to your organization, because every organization has its own unique culture. So what does an inclusive culture mean to you? How do you articulate that? What's the language that you need to use to describe your culture so that it sticks within the business? So when I worked at Deloitte, for example, we talked about a culture of respect and inclusion. We didn't talk about diversity and inclusion. We called it respect and inclusion. But that was the language that stuck for Deloitte, for example. Now, that kind of language may or may not work with other businesses. I've been working with an organization recently, and their employees are using language like friendliness, supportive culture. And so I'm encouraging my client to really kind of use that same language, because that seems to be what's sticking with the employees when it comes to articulating the culture. So the established phase is all about really setting a really strong foundation and bedrock for diversity and inclusion for you then to start building on top in a very practical sense. And that's where we go into Evolve stage. Now, within Evolve, change is all about treating diversity and inclusion just like any other change initiative that you've got in the organization. A lot of organizations treat diversity and inclusion like a project with a beginning and with an end. But diversity and inclusion isn't like a project. It's a way of being. It's a way of conducting ourselves. It's an ongoing thing. It doesn't really have an end. For as long as you exist, for as long as you employ people, you're going to have to keep focusing on diversity and inclusion. So it's about having a proper change management structure in place in order to be able to measure results. Because I think I said earlier that one of the biggest frustrations from D&I managers and HR directors is that they're just not seeing change happening fast enough. And having a proper change management approach enables you to make sure that you're working with the right stakeholders, you're able to make sure you're solving the right problems, you're able to measure progress, and you're able to measure the return on investment when it comes to any effort or finances that you put into D&I activities. Now, colleague experience and design is really a different way of thinking about diversity and inclusion. And this goes back to what I said earlier. Remember the screen where I had the kind of the wiggly road and the journey that people go on? This is about thinking about the journeys that employees go on, then breaking those journeys down into like little chunks and finding out where the speed humps and roadblocks exist that prevent people from completing a particular journey or being able to get through a journey at the same velocity as their colleagues. So, you might break your recruitment process down into individual chunks and then say, okay, so what's happening between these individual chunks? Which people are not getting through to the next chunk? Who are the people that are getting through the process more slowly than other people, and how can we make sure that we level the playing field for everybody? So it's taking human-centered design that I used to use when I worked in user experience and design and technology, but really applying it to the diversity and inclusion space. And then cyber is all about how we can use technology to scale up what we're doing about diversity and inclusion. So there's loads of innovations happening out there. So, there's artificial intelligence that can be used in the recruitment process that can try and reduce bias within the recruitment process. There's apps out there that enable you that give you employee data or employee insights so that you can get that very minutiae detail that you need in order to take targeted action. But within cyber, I talk about kind of the light side and the dark side of technology, because we have to be aware that there are things happening within technology that don't help us out in diversity and inclusion. So, for instance, we know that through artificial intelligence, that AI can adopt our biases of the engineers. So Amazon had to recently take some AI out of its recruitment process for being sexist, for instance. So we have to be really aware of how technology can hinder diversity, but also on the technology, it's about making sure that any technologies that you use, whether that's customer facing technology or internal facing technology for your employees, like your intranet, is accessible. So can somebody who is blind complete your mandatory training, if videos in your training don't have subtitles, for instance? And are they getting into trouble for not completing their mandatory training because they can't complete their mandatory training because the training is not accessible for them? So that's the kind of thing that we talk about in technology. Now, in the final stage of enhancing, this is collaboration and celebration. And collaboration is about how do we work as one whole organization. One of the biggest frustrations or complaints is that diversity and inclusion seems to fall on the shoulders of the HR department. But actually, the whole organization needs to take responsibility for diversity and inclusion. Procurement need to be thinking about how inclusive they are of being of suppliers from diverse backgrounds. Marketing need to think about how they're reflecting diversity within their marketing or advertising campaigns. The people that run your offices or your buildings need to think about how inclusive your buildings are. So are they accessible? Do you have gender neutral toilets? All those kinds of things. So it's a team approach. And if you're an organization that's large enough to have an employee resource group or employee diversity networks, it's about how you get those employee networks aligned to your central strategy so that they're not just going off and doing their own thing, that they are supporting you in your kind of central strategy in terms of inclusive growth. Now, celebration is at the end, and it's at the end on purpose because so many organizations do the celebration first and then do everything else. So they win awards, but the reality for employees the following morning after the award ceremony is that the organization is still not a particularly inclusive place to work. So celebrate. What you have to do is kind of have to do all of the hard work first so that you can kind of project this inclusive employer brand and EVP from the inside out. And therefore you're able to do it in a very genuine and authentic way. So for example, I've got a podcast that comes out every week called The Inclusive Growth Show. If you are interested, it's on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Now, I'm really excited because one of my guests in the next few weeks is going to be a guy who works for Timpsons, and Timpsons is the company that do shoe repair and cut your keys. And I'm really excited to be interviewing Timpsons because they have a really inclusive culture. They have a huge program about employing ex-offenders from prison, but they have this culture where people feel like they belong to the organization. But they've done all of the hard work inside, and then they're able to project that image out to the market in a very kind of genuine, authentic way. So listen out for that podcast, which is coming soon, because I'm particularly excited about that episode. So I said I was going to give you a template for diversity inclusion, and this is something that you can take away. And so really, the strategy is really to think about 4 key areas of activity. So this chart really aligns with the employee journeys that I talked about at the beginning of the webinar. So first of all, think about how you can attract talent in an inclusive way. So are you casting your net wide enough to attract a diverse range of people? Are you projecting an image where people look at your organization and can see themselves reflected so that they're drawn to come and work for you? Huge amount of activity around talent attraction in an inclusive way. Then there's the recruitment. So are you able to recruit the best people? Have you got an inclusive recruitment process where people are able to get through your recruitment process, or are there those speed humps or roadblocks that's preventing them or slowing them down? Once somebody's working in the organization, how can you develop people in an inclusive way? How can you enable people to perform at their best? And you might want to look at things like your talent management processes, for example. So if you were to kind of map your talent out onto the the typical 3x3 9-box performance grid, are you noticing a pattern of certain people not in the high performing, high potential box, for example? If so, get inquisitive. Why is that the case? Why are those people not appearing in the high performance, high potential box? And what targeted interventions can you take to help level the playing field? And then the fourth area is really thinking about your culture, what an inclusive culture looks like, how people can be themselves at work, how people can be, thrive, and how you can keep the best people. So these are kind of 4 grids. And the reason why this is a good way of thinking about your strategy is that a lot of organizations, they develop their strategy around the protected characteristics. So they might have a bucket of activity around gender, for example, and then another bucket of activity around ethnicity, and another bucket of activity around LGBT. And then a lot of organizations seem to miss off disability. But thinking in this kind of siloed way means that you're not really getting a good return on investment. It's not recognizing the intersectionality of us as human beings. The fact that, take me, for example, that, that I'm male, that I'm white, that I'm disabled, and that I'm gay. So thinking about me in those kind of individual compartments doesn't really appeal to all of me. But if you were to kind of say, okay, so how do we make sure that our talent attraction strategy or process is as inclusive as it can be? Or how do we make sure our recruitment process is as inclusive as it can be? You're catching a lot more people. So you're effectively, your time and your money goes further by thinking about it in these 4 key areas. And these are the 4 key areas that are the top ones that you really should be thinking about. Just again, another reminder that if you would like to have a strategy session with me, just drop me a line. I'll email you afterwards, but just drop a comment in the text and in the chat room, and then I can follow up with you afterwards. Just say something like, I'm interested, and then I'll just go back through the comments after this call. But within the D&I strategy session, I would just ask you loads of questions about your organization, about what's going right for you, what's frustrating you about diversity and inclusion in your business, where you ultimately want to get to. That gives me a really good understanding of your organization. And then I can offer you a strategy that might help you get on your way. And then if you think we're a good match, we can have a conversation about how I might be able to help you going forwards. But, I'm more than happy to have that strategy session with you. So I just wanted to end on really the importance of being agile when it comes to implementing diversity and inclusion. Organizations don't really take an agile approach. So I guess the drawback of that is that, or some of the issues of not being particularly agile, is that organizations end up not solving the right problems, that they kind of start implementing stuff. But they're not really getting to the root cause of the problem, so they're not really tackling the right issues. It feels that in some organization, it feels like D&I is done to you by the HR department, and that people are really not engaged in the journey that organizations go on. You end up wasting a lot of time and money. Again, that's kind of linked to the top number 1 point about not solving the right problems. And then change happens too slowly or not at all. And this is one of the biggest frustrations that I hear from senior leaders who are really keen to leave a legacy for their organization. They feel like, things are just not shifting fast enough for me to be able to leave that legacy. And then employees from the bottom up are also feeling that same frustration, because they turn up to work in the morning and they're like, it's just, really, I just don't feel like I fit into the business. So, these are some of the challenges. But taking an agile approach really does help overcome some of these drawbacks. And I will, what I'll do is I'll go through a useful framework for you that you can use. So I've just seen Liz says, I'd be keen to have a strategy session. Thanks, Liz. I look forward to chatting with you. I'll drop you an email after this, later today after the session, to get that booked in with you. So I look forward to chatting with you. So being an agile is really about kind of taking a cyclical approach to implementing diversity inclusion. Again, I've pinched stuff from when I worked in technology, when I used to work in agile teams implementing software. So I've taken a lot of my background from technology, but applying it to the D&I space. And the whole purpose of working in cycles is that you kind of work in time boxes. Now, in software development, a cycle is, typically 3 or 4 weeks. So you plan the cycle, you deliver the cycle, and then at the end you kind of demonstrate what you've done, you do a review, and then you just keep going around that cycle. Now, with diversity and inclusion, we're talking a lot about culture change. It's quite difficult to achieve stuff in 3 weeks. So when I work with my clients, I kind of work within cycles of 3 months or quarters effectively. But again, it's useful to have the same structure. So the first thing when you begin your cycle is to get your CEO and your board engagement, get them on board, start strategizing with them, get them to understand why diversity and inclusion is important, get them to sponsor all of the activity that you're going to do within that cycle. And the really good thing about working in cycles is that it's time boxed. So you know that it's a 3-month cycle. If you were to start today, let's say it's the end of October, but October, November, January. Let's say by the end of January, you say by the end of January, we know that's the end of our cycle. It's quite easy to see the finishing line. And you can start to have conversations about, what is feasible within 3 months. Let's not bite off more that we can chew. It helps you kind of size your work accordingly. But when you kind of start off your cycle, like I said, get that CEO, get that board engagement, do some listening exercises with your employees, that quantitative and qualitative data that I went through earlier, and then plan what you're going to deliver within that cycle. So what's achievable within that 3 months, for example, or whatever sized time box you're using. If you are interested in time boxing as a kind of time management technique or a project management technique, it's worth Googling. Just Google time boxing project management and watch some videos on YouTube. It's quite handy. Then you go to deliver. So that's where you implement the changes, go and get support from outside. You could get support from your diversity and inclusion networks. You could get support from, outside experts, key stakeholders within the business, key influencers, that kind of thing. So make sure you've got the right stakeholder planning in place. And then at the end of the cycle, it's really important that you review what you've done. So kind of showcase and celebrate what you've managed to achieve. Actually demonstrate, do show and tell, where you show people what you've actually produced and what you've actually managed to accomplish. Review your performance. Have a conversation with your team. What went well? What do we want to repeat next cycle? What didn't go so well? What do we need to improve on? And then measure your outcomes, because it's really important that you measure your outcomes at the end of every cycle, so that every 3 months or so you're able to kind of report back on the progress that you're able to make. And that you can demonstrate the progress that you're making. And this really goes back to that main frustration that people have in organizations, that they're just simply not making an impact when it comes to implementing diversity and inclusion. If you are interested, please go and get a book. I think Nikki has ordered a book, which is great. Thank you, Nikki. Sophia has read it and likes it. So if you are interested in what I've had to say this afternoon, please do go and get a book, my book from Amazon, and that will give you some reading to do. And just in summary, I just want to cover off what I've covered. So it's really important that we change the narrative when it comes to diversity and inclusion. And that means aligning diversity and inclusion to organizational resilience and regrowth or growth as we bounce back. Let the employee experiences inform your strategy by getting that quantitative and qualitative data and looking at it through various diversity lenses. Align your D&I to your vision, mission, and values and your corporate strategy, so that D&I is seen as an enabler for your organization rather than just this activity that you do on the side. Be strategic and sustainable. So don't just tick the boxes. You can use the framework that I've created as a way of getting that kind of sustainable approach. And then finally, implement D&I in a very agile way so that you can start to see results. And you can get, so you can start to see results and get that momentum and get people on board. Louise says, book is great, pragmatic, and so makes sense, Toby. Thank you. Oh, thanks, Louise. That's lovely. Thank you. So that's all I've got to say. Thank you ever so much for joining me this afternoon. I'm really, really grateful that you joined me this afternoon, sorry. As I said, if you've got any questions, feel free to drop me an email. My email address is toby@milden.co.uk. Happy to take any questions offline because we've run out of time. But thank you for joining me. Hope that was useful for the work that you're doing. Keep on doing great stuff around diversity and inclusion, and I look forward to connecting with you at some point in the future. Thanks very much. Goodbye.